Well, good afternoon, everybody. Or should I say good evening by the time you watch this. My name's Ian Douglas, and I'm your storyteller for the next 40 odd minutes, or, of course, however long you last. And I come to you today from the World Storytelling Cafe, and I must extend my thanks to the one and only John Rowe for asking me to record these stories. And you join me here on the Calden Canal in Staffordshire, because I sit at the doorway of our little boat, Hawker. My wife's off in the distance there. She's just poured me a drink. In anticipation of these tales, because you know you should always have something to wet your whistle. And so, I shall begin. And this first story, it takes us all the way north from Staffordshire, up through Cheshire, until eventually we come to Cumbria. And if you travel all the way through Cumbria, up through the Lake Road, until eventually you come to Keswick, turn left and travel all the way out past Cockermouth, until eventually you come to Workington, and then turn downwards on your way to Whitehaven, and then go inland slightly, and you'll come to a little water called Loweswater, or as the locals call it, Loweswater. Now Loweswater, or Loweswater, has an ancient woodland that surrounds it called Home Wood, and behind it there's a fell that's bare at the top. Now if you were to go into Home Wood and follow the path past the National Trust House where my friend Mark the Ranger lives, you'll notice that on the side of the water there's an old bothy house, an old stone house made of pebbles that were brought up from the lake, you see. Well, once upon a time, a long time ago, living in that old bothy house, there was a farmer and his wife, and they had a little dog called Turry. Now Turry, which indeed is an unusual name for a dog, was a Patterdale Terrier, a little yappy dog whose legs were so short they almost touched the ground. Well, he might have not been a sheepdog in the traditional sense of the word, but he did try his hardest, and each day he would go out with his master out onto the fells, and he would help to round up the sheep, and life was well. Now I don't know how much you know about your fairy folk, but in the north there's a fairy known as a boggle. Now if you've never come across a boggle before, I should probably describe them. Boggles grow no higher than this. Most of them have got bald heads, great big saucery eyes, hooked nose, sharp teeth. They're thin, they've got long stretching arms, and on the end claws to grasp you. They've got long legs and flappy feet, and they go round in bands, and they're partial to a meal. And do you know what they like to eat more than anything else? Children. But of course, if they can't get hold of children, they're partial to an old lady, although they do think that the meat's a little bit tougher. Well, unbeknownst to the farmer and his wife and Turry the dog, into a cave behind a waterfall in Home Wood, a little band of boggles had taken up residence, you see. There was about 50 of them, and they hid there during the day. And life went on as normal until that evening, and the sun went down over the top of the fell, and the moon came up over the Lawton Vale. Out from the cave came the band of boggles, and they sniffed the air. And what do you think they could smell? Old lady. Well, of course, the band of 50 boggles, they set off down through the trees, and all you could hear was the flap of their flappy feet. And as they walked down through the trees towards the bothy house, they sang their boggly song. Now, if you can learn it, you could sing it with me. Crash down the walls, smash down the door, carry the old woman away. Well, the farmer and his wife, they were up in their beds and they didn't hear any of the sound. But Turry was laid down the side of the fire and his little ears pricked up on his head. And what did Turry say? Well, that sent the Boggles screaming all the way back to their cave. And as they hid there that night, they thought to themselves, that's fine. Tomorrow is another night. But the next morning, the farmer came downstairs and he was all bleary-eyed. And he turned to his wife and he said, that dog, Turry, woke me up last night. And you know me, I like my 8 hours beauty sleep. Turry, heel. Well, Turry the dog was an obedient dog and he ran to the heel of his master. And the farmer picked up Turry and held him in front of his face and said, Turry, you woke me up last night and you know you shouldn't do that. And if you do it again, I shall punish you. And he put Turry down on the floor, and Turry looked at his master and thought, well, what have I done wrong? I only did what I was taught to do. But none the matter. The following day carried on like the day before. Up on the fells they rounded up the sheep until eventually night time came. The sun went down over the fell, the moon came up over Lawton Vale, and out from the cave came the Boggles, and they sniffed the air. And what could they smell? Old lady. Well, they came down to the trees on their flappy, flappy feet and they sang their boggly song. Do you remember? Well, then let's hear you. Crash down the walls, smash down the door, carry the old woman away. Well, Turry by the side of the fire, his ears pricked up, and what did Turry say? And that sent the Boggles screaming back to their cave. But the following morning, the farmer came down all bleary-eyed and he turned to his wife and he said he's done it again. This is the second time he's woken me up. I need my beauty sleep. Turry, heel. Well, Turry the dog was an obedient dog, as I told you, and he came and he sat by the heels of his master. And the farmer picked him up and held him in front of his face and said, Turry, I did warn you not to wake me up. But what's an appropriate punishment for a dog who wakes up his master twice? Well, there's nothing for it, Turry. The only thing I can do to teach you a lesson is take off your tail. Well, off came Turry's tail, and the farmer put it up on top of the shelf so Turry could see what would happen if he ever woke up his master again. Well, he put Turry down on the ground, and Turry looked up at his master and thought, well, why did he do that? I was only doing what I was taught to do. Well, that day went by pretty much the same as the rest. Up on the fell they rounded up the sheep until eventually they came back to the farmhouse. And down went the sun over the fell. And up came the moon over Lawton Vale. And out from the cave came the Boggles. They sniffed the air. And what could they smell? Old lady. And they came down to the trees on their flappy, flappy feet, and they sang their boggly song. Do you remember? Well, then let's hear you. Crash down the walls, smash down the door, carry the old woman away. Well, Turry's ears pricked up on his head, and what did Turry say? Well, the Boggles, they ran screaming, back to their cave, thinking it's okay. Tomorrow's another night. But the following morning the farmer came down, same as usual, all bleary-eyed, and he said he'd done it again. 3 times now. I thought he would learn his lesson, me taking off his tail. Turry, heel. Well, Turry, being an obedient dog, came to the heels of his master. And the farmer picked him up and held him in front of his face and said, Turry, yesterday I took off your tail to teach you a lesson. So what's an appropriate punishment for a dog who wakes up his master 3 times? Well, there's nothing for it. I'll have to take off your legs. Off came the 4 legs and he put them up on the shelf so Turry could see what would happen if he ever woke up his master again. He put him down on the ground and Turry looked up and he could see his tail and his legs and he thought, well, what did he do that for? I was only doing what my master told me to. Well, I'd like to say that the day went as normal, you see, but poor Turry couldn't join his master that day, what with him not having any legs, so he just lay by the fire and the farmer had to do all the work himself. Well, he rounded up the sheep until eventually the end of the day came. Down went the sun over the top of the fell. Up came the moon over Lawton Vale. And out from the cave came the Boggles. They sniffed the air. And what could they smell? Old lady. They came down to the trees on their flappy, flappy feet, and they sang their boggly song. Now you should know it by now, so let's hear you. Crash down the walls, smash down the door, carry the old woman away. But Turry by the side of the fire, his ears pricked up, and what did he say? And the Boggles ran screaming, back to their cave, thinking it's okay. There's always another night. But the following morning, down came the farmer, all bleary-eyed. He said, he's done it again. That dog's woke me up 4 times now. Turry, heel. But the problem was, you see, Turry couldn't heel because he had no legs, you see. So the farmer had to walk over to the fire and pick him up, and he held him in front of his face and said, Turry, I've taken off your tails. I've taken off your legs. So what's an appropriate punishment for a dog who wakes up his master 4 times? There's nothing for it. I'll have to take off your head. Off came Turry's head, and he put it up onto the shelf. And he put Turry down by the side of the fire. Now, I'd like to say that Turry looked up at the shelf to see what would happen if he ever did it again, but he couldn't, because his head was already up there, you see. He was just a body down by the side of the fire. Well, the farmer, once again, all by himself, went up onto the fells, and he rounded up the sheep, and the day went as normal until that evening. The sun went down over the fell. The moon came up over the Lawton Vale, and out from the cave came the Boggles, and they sniffed the air. And what could they smell? That's right, old lady. They came down to the trees on their flappy, flappy fleet, and they sang their boggly song. Come on, let's hear you. Crash down the walls, smash down the door, carry the old woman away. Well, I'd like to say that Turry's ears pricked up, but they couldn't because his head was on a shelf, and so there was nothing to scare the Boggles away, and so they smashed, and they crashed, and they bashed, until eventually the door splintered in, and into the bothy house there came a band of 50 Boggles. Well, suddenly the farmer knew the truth of it. And you know, he was such a coward, he hid under the bed, leaving his wife to the mercy of the Boggles. Well, they picked her up and they put her in a bag, and they tied the top with a rope and over their shoulders and off through the trees back to their cave. But you know, they took so long about it, what with dancing and singing along their way, in anticipation of their meal, that they didn't realise that the sun was suddenly starting to rise. Well, Boggles don't like the sun because it turns them to stone, you see, and in a panic they left the bag on the doorstep of the cave and they ran inside. But they thought to himself, no worry, we've got her now, and there's always another night. Well, with the shadows and the darkness gone, the farmer came downstairs, and he stood there with his hands on his head, and he thought, oh no, my poor wife, and Turry the dog, he was only trying to save us. Well, he took down the various parts of Turry and he put them out on the table, and he looked at them and he thought, well, what am I to do? Hang on, he thought to himself. I'm sure somewhere there's a roll of gaffer tape. So he ran around the kitchen and he found the gaffer tape, and you and I know that gaffer tape is the strongest tape in the world and will hold together the world itself if it needs to. And so on went the legs, on went the tail, on went the head, and what did Turry say? Yabba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba! And he licked his master's cheek. But he wasn't finished there. Turry jumped off the table and he went up through the trees until he came to the mouth of the cave. Well, he took his little teeth and he started to nibble until eventually a hole appeared, and out from that hole came the farmer's wife. Well, she ran down through the trees to her husband, and he was so glad to see her that they kissed and they cuddled for quite a long time. But that's another story. Turry wasn't finished. The hero of our story jumped inside the bag and he waited until eventually the sun went down over the fell. The moon came up over Lawton Vale, and out from the cave came the Boggles. Well, they sniffed the air. And And what could they smell? Old lady. Well, they went over to the bag and they untied the rope and they all peered inside. And what did Turry say? And he bit every boggle on the bum. And I'll tell you, they ran screaming over the top of the fell and eventually all the way down to a town called Whitehaven. And as far as I know, that's where they've resided ever since. And that's kind of the end of the story of the farmer, the wife, and the Turry the dog, and I'm sure they lived out their lives happily. But it's not the end of the tale, because here's a little task for you. When eventually we're allowed out of our houses and we can once again wander the land, make your way up to Cumbria, through the lakes until you get to Keswick, and then go out west, all the way to Workington, then turn downwards until you come to the town of Whitehaven. Now, I will tell you that in Whitehaven there is the finest example of Georgian architecture in the whole of the country. But don't mind about that. Make your way down to the high street. You'll notice it. It's all cobbled and there's plenty of cafes there so you can get yourself a little coffee. Now, don't sit in, sit out. And as you sat out there drinking your coffee and eating your cake, don't be chitter-chattering. Be people watching. Now, don't so much worry about the ladies. You keep an eye on the men in Whitehaven because most of them are quite short. Quite often, they're bald. They've got big saucery eyes, stretching arms with sharp nails, flappy, flappy feet, and most of them have an old lady on their arm. And that, dear friends, is the end of that story. I thank you. Well, it's very nice to have you here in our little living room on our little boat down here on the Calden Canal, and I must say it's a beautiful day, although it's very sad that we can't go out that much at the moment due to the coronavirus. But we won't dwell on that. We'll think of happier times. And I got to thinking earlier about the kind of stories that I'd like to tell you. And I was thinking I'd maybe tell you something a little bit more meaningful. And I got to thinking about the many people that I've met upon the road. See, I've been telling stories now for over 20 years, and I've had the privilege over that time to learn stories from many different storytellers. Our friend John Rowe is one of them. But I have to pay homage to my mentor, and that's a man called Taffy Thomas. You see, Taffy, if you don't know him, and I'm sure you will, was given the MBE for services to storytelling, but he was also asked to be the first laureate for storytelling. And if you don't know what a laureate is, think of them a little bit like a champion of stories. But imagine being the first laureate for storytelling. Now that's an accolade they'll never take away from him. Now during that time, I was working around about the same area as Taffy, and I thought to myself, well, you know, you can't compete with the laureate. And so I decided to go and knock on his door. And I asked him if he needed an apprentice. Well, eventually, after a little bit of nudging from me, he gave in. And he welcomed me into his life. And he taught me many, many stories. And I'd like to offer you this one. And it comes through Taffy, through me, to you. But you must remember that when I tell you this story, I'm thinking of Taffy, and you could almost hear his words, not mine. This is a story about making your own luck. Once upon a time, there was the most unlucky man in the world. Now, the most unlucky man in the world, one day, he went and put his hands inside his pockets. And just like I am doing right now, he felt that his pockets were empty. The man had no money, you see. But it was worse than that. When the man went to the cupboards to find food to feed his family, when he opened up the doors of the cupboards, there was no food inside. So no money in his pockets and no food in the cupboards. But it was worse than that. You see, the man was married. Now, before you start, that wasn't the bad luck. His wife had always wanted to have a baby, but as often as they tried, no baby arrived. In fact, the man had made a simple wooden crib with his own hands, but that crib, it lay idle in the corner of the room. And you know, it saddened him to see his wife so sad. So there was no money, there was no food in the cupboards, and there was an empty crib. But it was worse than that. In the little cottage that they lived in, his old mum had lived in there as well, you see, and well, she was so old, she'd lost the power of her sight. And so most days, she sat in a chair in the corner of the room with her eyes all clouded over and a sad look on his face. And you know, it saddened him to see his mum so sad. And so there was no money, there was no food, there was no baby in the crib, and there was a blind mum. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, Ian, I thought you said you were going to cheer us up in this time of sadness. Don't worry, the end of the story is coming soon. Well, one day this very unlucky man, he decided to himself that you find your own luck in life. And he decided he was going to change his luck. And so he went out of his house one morning and he went down the road until he came to his neighbour's house. And when he arrived at his neighbour's house, he knocked on the door. And his neighbour came to the door and he asked what he wanted. Well, he said that he was going to go off into the forest hunting, but what he needed was the loan of a gun. He was going to provide some food for his family. The least he could do as a man was put food on the table. Maybe he could shoot a bird from the sky or a beast in the bushes. Well, the neighbour offered him the gun, as good neighbours do, and he set off. Well, he travelled into the trees, and the trees got thicker and denser. But the strange thing was, well, he knew these woodlands well. But as he walked through them, it was like he was in the strangest of places, a place he'd never been, because all around him, where normally there would be sights and sounds, there was nothing to be seen. The trees went on forever and ever, as far as he could see, but there were no sounds of birds. There were no rustling in the bushes. The place was silent. However, he travelled on. But as hard as he looked, he could see no birds in the branches, no beasts in the bushes. And he travelled on, until eventually the only thing he noticed was the light starting to dim. The sun was setting. And he knew that he'd failed. And he decided that now was the time, before it got too dark, to turn round and go home to his wife and his mum and say, even in this he'd failed, and his heart sunk in his chest, when suddenly he looked into the distance and he saw the strangest of sights. Off in the distance, amongst the trees, there was a bright, glowing, white light. Well, he knew it wasn't the light of the setting sun. It was too bright, you see. And so he went towards it, tentatively and slowly and as quietly as he could, until eventually he stood at the edge of a clearing and he peered in amongst the trees. And to his amazement, and his eyes opened wide at the sight, he saw in the centre of that clearing an animal he'd only ever heard of in stories and in legends, standing beautiful, silvery hair all over its body, from its forehead a spiraled golden horn. There was a unicorn, and as he looked he could see that that unicorn's hoof was caught in a trap, and the man's thought was yum yum, unicorn stew. And so he raised his gun and he aimed it towards the unicorn. But just before he pulled the trigger, suddenly he heard a voice in his head. And he knew that that voice came from the unicorn. And the voice said, "Stop. Don't shoot me. I am a magical creature. And instead of shooting me, if you come and save me, open up this trap and let me loose, I shall give you a gift that might answer all of your problems. I shall grant you a wish. And if you use it wisely, well, who knows what might happen." The man thought to himself, great, I'll wish for money. And he ran into the clearing, and he bent down on the ground, and fearlessly he opened up the trap and let the unicorn's hoof come out. But then the unicorn looked at him, and in his head the man heard the voice once again, and the voice said, listen, money's not the answer to all of your problems. You've got more problems than just one, but you only have a single wish. Use it wisely. Well, if the man's first thought was for money, his second was for food. His third turned to his wife and the baby that she'd always had, and his fourth turned to his mum and her blindness and her sadness. So he was left with a quandary, and he scratched his chin. Well, I can hear you now at home listening to this story and thinking to yourself, well, if you were posed with the same problem, what would you wish for? And maybe it would be the money. Maybe it would be food. Maybe it would be the baby. Or maybe you'd have a sneaky little wish to wish for more wishes, but that's not allowed. You see, this story, as Taffy will tell you, carries a name. This story is called The Clever Wish. And I'll tell you what the man wished for. It suddenly came to him, and he looked at the unicorn and he said this: I wish to be at home, and in the corner of the room will be my old mum, and she will be smiling from ear to ear, because she will be able to see me and my wife stood side by side, looking down into a golden cradle, and in it a beautiful baby girl. Well, suddenly there was a flash of white light. When the man's vision cleared, he could see he was no longer in the trees. He was indeed at home. And as he looked across the room, there was his mum, and you see the cloud had lifted from her sight. She could see, and wasn't she smiling with glee? And when he looked to his side, there was his wife, smiling too, her eyes bright with wonder. And he looked down and saw the golden cradle and the most beautiful baby girl he'd ever seen. But you know, the story's not quite ended, because you probably know this yourself. Babies don't need golden cradles. So the very next day, that man picked up the baby and put it into the simple wooden cradle he'd made with his own hands. The golden cradle he took down to the market, and he sold it for as much money as he could get. And that was enough to feed and clothe and keep his family well for the rest of their days. And that, dear friends, is the end of a story from Taffy Thomas, the first laureate for storytelling, through me to you. And now you can tell it to all your friends. I thank you. Well, would you look at the time? We've been going for half an hour, which only gives me 15 minutes left. So I'm going to try and squeeze 2 more stories in for you, if I can. And I was thinking of a funny story. I was thinking of lightness today. And I was thinking of this story. I have lots of stories that are Cumbrian based, just because I've worked up in Cumbria quite a lot. And I got this story quite a few years ago. And it's a story that was given to me by a friend of mine called Richard Gibb. And Richard Gibb is a fine fella from Aberdeenshire. And he swears down, and he'll tell you to this day that this story comes from there. But nay, it's from Maryport. Maryport, my friends, is a little coastal town, a little harbour town up there on the west of Cumbria. And if you've never been to Maryport, it's a fine little harbour with a steep road that runs out from the harbour and up onto the high street, and at the top of it you'll see the Labour Club on the right hand side, and a fine little cafe called Annabelle's, where you can get good coffee and good tea. And I can tell you a good story about that cafe, but that's probably for another time because it's a longer tale. This story is all about fishermen, and it's a story all about 6 silly fishermen. Now, to tell you the story, I need to teach you their names. So I hope you've got good memories. And I'm going to use my fingers to represent the men inside the story. So here we go. Here I'm going to use my thumb, and this is the first man here. Here he is. And his name, ladies and gentlemen, his name is Seth. All right, so let's test you. Are you ready? Who's this? Well done. Well remembered. So that now we know his name. Let's move on to man number 2. Here he is on my pointy Peter. And his name isn't Peter. His name is, hang on, let me remember. Yep, that's right. His name is Seth. Have you got it? Cool. Let's remind you. Who's this? Well done. And who's this? Very good. Let's move on to man number 3. Here he is. He's on my middle finger here alongside his friends here. And his name, what's that here you say? Seth? How could it be? 3 men called Seth. Well, what could their friends be? Let's test you. Who's this? Seth. Who's this? Seth. Who's this? Seth. Who's this? Seth. Who's this? Who's this? And who's this? No, that's Tom. You see, Tom isn't in the story because that would make 7 men. And there's only 6, like I told you. Once upon a time, there were 6 silly men called Seth. And what they had in common was that they were all fishermen. They owned a boat in Maryport Harbour. And each day, the 6 silly Seths would go down to their boat, they would go out into the sea, and they would try and catch fish. Now, I must tell you something about the 6 silly Seths. Not only were they called Seth, not only were they silly, not only were they fishermen, they were also rubbish. They were the worst fishermen the world had ever seen. In fact, in the years that they'd been trying to catch fish together, they'd never caught a single catch. And so, picture the scene. The morning of the story arrives. They're around at Seth's house, around the table. But that morning, they're joined by their wives. And so there are 12 people round the table, all having a cup of tea. And the 6 wives of the 6 silly Seths, they turn to their husbands and they say, now listen, boys, it's not past your attention that you're actually quite rubbish at catching fish. And so we've decided that today is your last day. If today you don't catch any fish, you'll sell your boat, you'll give up your job, and you'll go find other ways of making money, because we've got bills to pay. Well, the 6 silly Seths, they opened up their eyes. They fell back into their chairs, their mouths opened wide, and they looked at their wives. And they said, what do you mean give up fishing? It's our lives. They said, yeah, but you're not very good at it. This is your last chance. Well, they went out into the hall and they pulled on their wellies. They put on their wet skins. They went out of their door on Senhouse Street. They went all the way down into the harbour. They climbed upon their boat and they started up the engine. Dugga-dugga-dugga-dugga-dugga. That's the sound of the engine, you see. And they set sail out onto the Solway to catch fish. Now they got to a favourite place until eventually they dropped down to the anchor. They turned off the main engine and they turned on the hydraulic, you see. They loaded up the net with bait and then they lowered the net down into the sea and they left it there for about an hour. They had another cup of tea and then an hour later they turned the winch and up it came. Out from the water came the net. And was there any fish inside? Oh yes, there were. But there wasn't just one. There wasn't 10. There wasn't 100. There wasn't 1,000. There were millions of silvery fish filling that net until it was fit to burst. In fact, there were so many fish inside the net. Well, the 6 silly Seths, they'd never seen so many fish. In fact, they'd never seen fish before. And Seth turned to the other Seths and said, how, lads? What are we going to do with all that fish? Well, Seth turned round to Seth and said, well, the other fishermen, when they catch fish, they go down to the market and they sell it for the best price they can. Right, said the Seths, let's do that. Well, down from the net spilled the fish, and they prepped that fish, they put it on ice, they turned the boat round, dugga-dugga-dugga, they went all the way back to the harbour. When they got to the harbour, they took out the fish, they took it to the market, and they sold it for a great big bag of money. But the thing was, you see, they'd never seen so much money, and they didn't know what to do with it. And Seth said to the lads, he said, oh, lads, what are we going to do with all this cash? And Seth said, well, that's fine, there's a pub over there. Why don't we pop inside there and have ourselves a pint? And we'll sit around the table and we'll count out the cash. Great, said Seth. Let me count. Because Seth liked to count, you see. So into the pub they went. They got themselves a pint. They sat round a big round table and Seth counted out the cash until eventually he knew how much money there was. But Seth said, now it's all right, Seth, you knowing how much money there is, but what do we do with it now? And Seth said, well, that's easy. All we do is we count ourselves. And we know when we know how many of us there are, all we have to do is divide the money equally. Fine, said Seth. Let me do the counting, because Seth liked to count, you see. And so he stood in front of his friends and he started to count. Now, I can't quite see you through this mode of technology, but I can only imagine that you're quite intelligent people. So you see if you can see or work out what Seth does wrong. He stands there and he counts. He says, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hang on, he says. I'm sure there were 6 of us before. Can you work out what he did wrong? I'm sure you can. Seth said you must have miscounted. Let's swap places and I'll have a go. So Seth swapped for Seth. And Seth stood in front of his friends and said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh no, he said. Seth's gone missing. He must have got lost down at the harbour. Quick! And as quick as a flash, forgetting about all the money, they ran out from the pub, they went down to the harbour and they started to shout for their friends, Seth! Seth! Well, they couldn't find Seth anywhere. They looked all over the place until eventually there was only one place they hadn't looked, you see. And that was at the top of Wellhead Lane. Now, if you don't know Wellhead Lane, it's one of those old cobbledy streets. And at the top of it, there used to be an old well, you see. It's been filled in now due to health and safety, but a long time ago it was deep, and at the bottom of it there was water, you see. And so they ran to the well, and Seth said, hey, maybe Seth's fallen down the well. I better have a look. And so he looked over the side. Now, I did say that you looked like, or I would imagine that you're quite intelligent people. And you can probably tell me what you see when you look in a mirror. That's right, you see your reflection, don't you? Well, standing water is a little bit like a mirror. And when Seth looked over the side and down into the water, who do you think he saw looking right back at him? I'm sure you can work that out as well. But he didn't know. He said, look, down there at the bottom of the well, it's Seth. I think he must have fallen down. What are we going to do? And to make sure he was okay, he gave him a little wave. And of course, Seth at the bottom of the well waved right back at him. I know, said Seth. Why don't you lower yourself down and stretch down and pull him out? So Seth stretched over the side of the well. Well, Seth stretched down and Seth stretched back up, but it was too deep and he couldn't reach him. Don't worry, said Seth. I'll take you by the ankles and I'll lower you down. Well, Seth got the ankles of Seth and he lowered him down the well, and Seth stretched down and Seth stretched up, but it was still too deep, couldn't reach. Don't worry, said Seth. I'll lower both of you down. Well, Seth got the ankles of Seth, who had the ankles of Seth. And Seth stretched down and Seth stretched up, but it was still too deep, couldn't reach. Don't worry, said Seth. I'll lower all 3 of you down. Well, Seth got the ankles of Seth, who got the ankles of Seth, who got the ankles of Seth. And Seth stretched down and Seth stretched up, but it was still too deep, couldn't reach. Don't worry, said Seth. I'll lower all 4 of you down. Well, Seth got the ankles of Seth, who got the ankles of Seth, who got the ankles of Seth, who got the ankles of Seth. And Seth stretched down and Seth stretched up, but it was still too deep, couldn't reach. Don't worry, said Seth. I'll lower all 5 of you down. Well, Seth got the ankles of Seth, who got the ankles of Seth, got the ankles of Seth, who got the ankles of Seth, who got the ankles of Seth. And Seth stretched down and Seth stretched up, but it was still too deep, he couldn't reach. But by this point, the combined weight of all the Seths was so great that he started to struggle under the strain, and his knees started to knock, and the strain went up his back, and a sweat came to his brow, and he thought, I'm going to drop them, and they'll all be down in the well. When suddenly, up the road came the 6 wives of the 6 silly Seths, and they said, what are you doing? And Seth looked at the wives and said, it's Seth, he's fallen down the well and we're trying to pull him up. Well, they looked over the side of the well to the bottom, and then they looked back at their husband, and they said, Seth has not fallen down the well. Now pull yourselves up. And suddenly, they all stood in a line. And they said, you see, you're all there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, said the Seths. Happen we must have pulled him up after all. And they all went home and had a nice cup of tea. And that, dear friends, is the end of the story of the 6 silly Seths. I thank you. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the stories, and I'm just looking at the little timer on the top of my little video, and it's saying 40 minutes. So I've actually only got time to tell you one last story. And I was wondering which story to tell you, and I thought I might quickly tell you this one if you don't mind. Now, I got this story a few years ago, and it came originally from, I think, Alan Garner, a great writer of children's literature and a great collector of stories, found this story. And my friend Daniel Serridge, who's a storyteller up there in, I think he's still up in Glasgow telling tales. I heard him tell it first, and I thought I'd tell you this story because it's a good old northern story to finish off our little session. And I'll leave you to the end of your day, evening, and I'm going to carry on and drink some gin. So, it's a story, and I'm going to teach you a word now that you probably don't use, but it's a great word, and I fully expect to hear this word being used a lot more in daily life, and you can use it for those people who are going out and doing far too much in the outdoors at the moment and not abiding by the rules and staying inside. You can use it to describe those people, and the word is gowk. Now, if you look in the English dictionary, the word gowk, G-O-W-K, is in there, and it's got two meanings. It means the core of an apple or a half-wit, and this story concerns half-wits, and it goes like this. Once upon a time there was a farmer, his wife and their daughter Matilda. Now Matilda was due to get married to a boy called Tom. And on the day of the story, the old farmer was going down towards the well to draw water, you see. And as he was walking down, he was thinking about the approaching wedding. And he got to thinking, and this is what he thought in his head. And he probably said it out aloud because he was one of those kind of fellas. He thought, you know, if our Tilda were to marry Tom, and Tilda were to have a baby, and the baby were to grow up strong enough to come down here by the well and climb up onto the wall of the well and tittle-tottle round the edge and fall in, what a terrible thing that would be. And in fact, it was so vivid in his mind that he was so frightened he started crying. Wah! Well, the sound was so loud that it travelled up the road back to the farmhouse, and his wife heard it, and she came running down, and she says, "Oh, father, what's the matter?" He said, "I was just thinking about our Tilda marrying Tom, and if they were to ever have a baby were to grow strong enough to come down here and climb upon the wall of the well and tittle-tottle round the edge and fall in, what a terrible thing that would be." Well, she agreed, you see, and they were so upset that they both cried. "Ah!" Well, the sound was so loud that it travelled back up towards the farmhouse where Matilda was sitting, having a cup of tea, and she heard the sound. She was concerned. She ran down to the well, and she saw her mother and father. She said, "Mother, father, what's matter?" They said, "We were just thinking about you marrying Tom and having a baby, you see, and baby growing strong enough to come down here to the side of the well and climb upon the wall and tittle-tottle round the edge and fall in, and what a terrible thing that would be." And Matilda, she agreed, and she burst into tears. Whoa! Well, the sound was so terrible, it went up into the town where Tom was working, and he heard the sound, and concerned, he came running down towards them and said, "Mother, father, Tilda, what's matter?" They said, "We were just thinking if you were to marry our Tilda and you were to have a baby, and baby were to grow strong enough to come down here to the well and climb up on the wall, tittle-tottle round the edge and fall in, what a terrible thing that would be." And again the three of them burst into tears. Whoa. Well, Tom, he wasn't as daft as the other three, and he said, "Now listen here, I've come up with a plan inside my mind that might solve the problem." They said, "Well, what's that, Tom?" He said, "Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go into town and I'll buy myself a stout pair of leather brogues with good soles upon them, and I shall go for a walk. And if, by the time the leather on the soles of the shoes have worn out, I haven't met 3 gowks as stupid as you, I shall do something even more drastic." They said, "What's that, Tom?" He said, "I won't marry you, Matilda." And true to his word, he set off. Well, he went all the way into town. He went to the cobbler's shop, and there he found himself a fine pair of brogues, and they had good soles on them. He put them on, he got himself a stout stick, and he set off walking for what he thought would be a long, long journey. But he was only just round the corner when he saw the first strange sight. He saw at the side of the road a man, and in his hand he had a stone, and by the side a big pile of them. And in his hand, the other hand, he had a knife. Well, it was once sharp, but it was now blunt, and he was jabbing away at the stone. And he said, "Excuse me, fella, what are you doing?" He said, "Well, I've heard that in these here parts, inside some of the stones, there are juicy kernels to be had at, and here's me stabbing away with a knife to get at the juicy kernel." Well, Tom said to himself, "Now listen here, fella, would you not be better off using a stonemason's hammer and chisel to break open the stone, and then you wouldn't break so many knives?" And he looked, and he could see there was a pile of broken knives. And the man looked up at Tom and said, "Oh, Tom, I wish you'd come along a little bit earlier, and then I wouldn't have broken all these knives here." Tom thought to himself, "Well, there's one gowk," and he made a little notch in his walking stick, and he walked a little further. Well, he'd only just got round the corner when he came across an even more curious sight. There was a barn, and outside the barn there was a farmer with a pitchfork, and the farmer was working as hard as he could, but there was nothing on the end of the pitchfork. For all he could see, he was shovelling fresh air. Well, he went down to the farmer and he asked him what was going on, and the farmer looked at Tom, and he was very glad of the break. He said, "Tom, it's been a wet summer indeed, and you know, all the hay in the barn is damp. And well, me here, I'm shoveling the sunshine inside to try and dry out all the straw." Well, Tom scratched his head and he said, "Now listen here, fella, would you not be better to bring the straw outside and dry it in the sunshine? Would that not be easier?" Well, the man looked at Tom and said, "Thank you, Tom. I wish you'd come along a little bit earlier, and then I wouldn't have broke all these pitchforks here." And he could see there was a great big pile of them. "That's two gowks," thought Tom, and he marched another notch in his stick and set off walking. But he'd only just got round the corner when he saw the third and strangest sight. There was a farmhouse, and on one side of the farmhouse there was a farmer, and the farmer had a rope in his hand. He was pulling so hard that his face had gone bright red. But as Tom looked, he could see that the rope went all the way over the side of the house, down to the other side, and on the other side there was a cow, and the rope was tied around the cow's neck. But as hard as the farmer was pulling, the cow didn't move at all. And Tom went down and said, "Now listen here, fella, you're going to burst your belly if you don't stop doing that. And may I ask what it is you're about?" And the farmer looked at Tom. He was glad of the break, and he said, "Tom, you've probably heard it was a wet summer. And you know, all the straw being wet, here's me trying to lift the cows up onto the roof so they can eat the moss in the gutters." And Tom looked and said, "Would you not be better to get a ladder and go up there and cut the moss and throw it down for the cows?" And the farmer looked at Tom and said, "Tom, I wish you'd come across a little bit earlier, and then I wouldn't have throttled all those cows down there." And Tom could see there was a big pile of cows. And Tom thought, well, there's three gowks, and he marked a notch on his stick. And then he went home. And true to his word, he married Matilda, and he was wearing his stout brogues, and you know, they still had a lot of leather on them. And a few years later, Tom and Matilda, they had a baby. And when it was born, Tom did something that would solve the problem if ever the baby fell in the well. He taught that baby to swim. And that, dear friends, is the end of the story of the three gowks. And sadly, it's the end of our time together. So thank you for joining me here today for my tales upon the boat Hawker. And as the gypsies say, if I don't see you soon, I'll see you on another road somewhere. I thank you.